So today's webinar is focusing around the changes that are coming very soon in April this year. What we're going to do is we've got two other guest speakers with us today. We've got Matt Tyler from Larsen, Howie, and Andrew Chamberlain from IPSE, both which I'll let do their own introduction. But hopefully we can give you a very well-rounded view on what's going on, what you need to look out for, and kind of some next steps. So we want to make this very practical, so you've all got something to kind of go away with after today's session. So Andy's going to kick us off today with a bit of an update on the legislation and exactly where the government are at the moment. I'm sure you've all seen that there's still a lot of hype going on. Is it coming? Is it not? So hopefully Andy can give a bit more clarification around that. Matt's then going to take us through some of the key factors of what you need to look at when determining status. And hopefully this will be really helpful to all of you who are contractors out there, because I think the biggest thing we want you to take away from today is your part to play here, that although responsibility and liability is shifting, what you can do here is go and take this information to your end clients and to your recruiters. So Matt's going to kick off with some of those key factors of how you can kind of educate your clients and recruiters of what your IR35 status is. And then I will finish up with what you can expect from your clients and recruiters. So what you're seeing in the market, in the press at the moment about what's happening, what solutions are out there. Everyone at the moment is an IR35 expert. So I think we can hopefully provide some clarity around that and what you should be looking at to do next. We'll hopefully finish off with a Q&A session at the end. We have quite a lot of participants on today's session, so for any questions that we don't manage to get to, we will do a follow-up afterwards. So I'll pass over now to Andy, who can do an introduction and then kick us off with an update.
Thanks, Nicola. So yes, I'm Andy Chamberlain. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy at IPSE. IPSE is the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed. So our members are contractors, and many of them are already impacted by IR35 and will be impacted by these changes that we're here to talk about today. Now, I know Matt's going to sort of go into the sort of details of what IR35 is, so I'm just going to very quickly update you before we get to that stage on kind of what's been going on and the kind of political machinations that have been happening around IR35, because it has been a highly politicised issue, not least during the election campaign, when in December there was a move by the Lib Dems to put reviewing this IR35 changes into their manifesto. The SNP did the same thing, and Labour very quickly moved and said that they would do the same thing. They actually came to one of our husting events. We had Bill Esserson there, who's the shadow minister, and he suggested that they would delay it, which everyone got excited about, but then he kind of rode back from that. Anyway, Labour were very clearly going to do something on this. So somewhat perhaps belatedly in the campaign, but about 2 weeks before the election date, Sajid Javid went on the Moneybox Radio 4 programme and announced that his words were, one thing that we're going to look at again is IR35. And then you can see on your screen there, that's a copy of a tweet that was sent by my MP, Dominic Raab, Brexit Secretary, after Sajid Javid, of course, former Chancellor, had made that statement. And it's pretty clear. It says, we will review the changes to IR35. So we were all getting excited and saying, this is good. We're going to have a proper look again at these rules, because as you will soon realise if you don't already, IPSE's view is that we're very much opposed to this. I have a slide coming up where I talk a little bit about our activity in that area. However, after the election, in early January, the Treasury put out a statement announcing the review, and you can see the wording there. They say the review will determine if any further steps can be taken to ensure the smooth and successful implementation of the reforms, which are due to come into force in April 2020. So this was a pretty big blow to us, because we were petitioning for a more thorough review that would take longer than that and that would necessitate a delay to implementation. Nevertheless, which the government decided they would not do, and the wording of it all was very much like, we're still going to do this, we're just going to see if we can maybe make some tweaks. Now, we were supposed to have heard what the outcome of this, because they talked about reporting in mid-February. We're now, what, 3 weeks away from the budget, so time is really sort of running out, and this is one of the big concerns with the whole thing. You know, are businesses ready? Well, potentially, how can they be? Because they haven't seen the final legislation yet. We haven't heard the outcome of this review, but I do expect that that will happen pretty soon. Overall, though, I mean, we do think that this review is not going to be introducing fundamental changes. There may be a few tweaks. So the draft clauses for the finance bill for the off-payroll working rules were published in July, and you can find that online and look at them. But there are already some changes to that, and the final legislation, we're told, will be with us shortly after the budget. Some people are asking for it to be published sooner than that. One tweak that they have made and they have announced is that the critical date has shifted to when work is performed, not when the payment is made. And what that's all about is, originally the idea was that any payments made to a contractor after on or after April the 6th, you would have had to have deducted tax from those payments if it had been decided that IR35 applied to that engagement. They've changed that now, and what they've said is that it's about when the work is done, not when the payment is made, which means that work that's being done right now, right up until April the 5th, you can pay that. Even if you pay it after April the 6th, you can pay them gross without worrying about the IR35 status. But it's if the work is performed after April the 6th, that's when we have to start thinking about the IR35 status and then subsequent changes to how they're paid. A couple of other things worth mentioning that I know that there's a lot of lobbying on from various groups. So we might see, I'm just saying we might see some tweaks here. We may not. I mean, HMRC haven't actually indicated they're going to, but there's a small business exemption. And a lot of the agency groups, and indeed IPSE too, have said that if a small business wants to rely on the exemption so that they don't have to enter into this new regime of IR35, they should explain to the supply chain and to the contractor that they are a small business. That way the contractor will know, oh, I've got the liability for this, and perhaps I need to have some tax investigation insurance in place. You know, perhaps I need to be a member of IPSE because we offer that protection to our members. And if they don't get that explicit message, there could be confusion about where the liability lies. Government hasn't said that they're going to do something on this, but I know that they've had quite a lot of people suggesting that they should do. So that's one to look out for. The other thing is that under the rules as the way they're currently drafted, the end client must produce something called a status determination statement. And a status determination statement, or SDS, must say, does IR35 apply or not, the reasons for that, and they have to take reasonable care when they come to those decisions. If they don't take reasonable care, then it's not an SDS. Now, if they pass that down to the agency in the chain and HMRC come along at a later date and say, look, we disagree with your decision. We think IR35 perhaps did apply when you said it didn't, but we can see that you've taken reasonable care, so you don't have any liability, client. That shifts down to the agency. A lot of people thinking that's a bit unfair. You know, if the agency's being told in good faith that the client's saying IR35 doesn't apply, they should be able to rely on that determination. So that could potentially change too. I think it should do. We'll wait and see. There's also, as well as the government-led review, there is a House of Lords review going on. It's the Finance Bill Subcommittee, and they're looking specifically at this issue. I will be going in to give evidence on that on Monday. IPSE has submitted written evidence. I know that the chairman of that review, Lord Forsyth, has said that he has had an unprecedented number of emails and responses into that inquiry, so they've been swamped. So, you know, there's a lot of big feeling out there. I know a lot of people have written to their MPs. I know a lot of MPs are talking to the Treasury around this, all of which is really geared towards the big question of, is this going to be delayed? Because a lot of people think that it should be. Right now, it's not being delayed. Right now, everyone should prepare for this to come in April. It's also true, I think, to say that the closer we get to the date, the less likely a delay is, because as many of you will have seen, businesses have already taken decisions based on this. So IPSE is still pushing for a delay. We believe it should be delayed. We think businesses aren't ready. We haven't even seen the final legislation. We've got this review which hasn't even reported yet. So it's really leaving it too late. I think that all hope is not lost on that. We are still fighting to the end, but I do think that businesses should prepare and anticipate that this does come in April, unfortunately. So quick note about what we do and what we've been up to. So we used to be called PCG, the Professional Contractors Group, and we were actually formed in direct opposition to the initial version of IR35, which was announced in the 1999 budget. And we are a lobby group which has campaigned against IR35. We've campaigned for it to be abolished, and we have campaigned against these changes, the ones that came in the public sector in 2017, and indeed these ones that we're talking about now. We think that this is going to be very, very bad for business, bad for contracting. We think self-employed businesses are going to have to close as a result of this, which is a great shame. And they are entirely compliant self-employed businesses, by the way, as well. The type of things that we do is we respond to the consultations, we do research, we forge alliances such as with Kingsbridge and also with the CBI and various other groups. We're a member of the IR35 forum, and you can see some photos there. We were involved with a organised protest of Parliament, which took place a couple of weeks ago. The photo on the right, you can see David Davis there. That's me standing on his right as you look at it. And we are still trying to contact the new Chancellor. We've written to him, and we don't know what he thinks of IR35 and whether there is a lifeline there. Mind you, we never really knew what Sajid Javid thought about it. He never mentioned it publicly, apart from that one mention on the Moneybox programme, which led to the review. He was quite hard to read. The Chancellor before that, Philip Hammond, we did know what he thought. He wanted to bring this change in. But Rishi Sunak is a bit of a new entity. So, you know, we are hoping that he might bring a fresh pair of eyes to this, recognise the level of concern that's out there, and possibly hit the pause button on this. But as I say, right now, there's no indication from government that that's going to happen, and businesses should prepare. Thanks.
Okay, right. So my name's Matt Tyler. I am the Contract and Status Manager at Larsen Howie. I've been looking at IR35 and dealing with contractors and their contracts and their working practices for the last about 9 years now. So I'm very familiar with essentially what has happened up to the private sector and public sector changes, and what's happening past them as well. What essentially I'm going to go through is sort of a crash course in relation to IR35, what exactly it is. So obviously we've heard what's going to be happening going forward, or at least where the legislation sits at the moment, but perhaps you don't have a solid understanding as to exactly what IR35 is. And that's the idea of the presentation that I'm going to be putting here. So in short, IR35 is a piece of legislation that was introduced by HMRC in 2000 to try and counteract what they saw as being the rising threat of contractors who were effectively operating as employees, but via a limited company. Now, as I'm sure everyone here knows, limited company contractors pay, well, I suppose straight off the bat at the time, they paid considerably less tax than employees did, which is why people were making the move. They were effectively leaving the job on the Friday, then coming back on the Monday as a contractor, paying considerably less tax. HMRC didn't like that. They introduced IR35 to try and counteract that, and that has caused pretty much everybody in the contracting sphere a headache ever since. In 2017, rules were changed so that instead of it being the contractor who was responsible for determining their IR35 status, the liability was changed, the liability and responsibility, I should say, was switched from the contractor to the end client in the public sector. Many people saw this as being a test bed, I suppose, of what's going to happen going forward for the private sector. But at the time, HMRC were very adamant in saying they have absolutely no plans to move it into the private sector. Naturally, about a year or so afterwards, they then announced plans to move it into the private sector, which has then brought us on to where we are today in respects to trying to get ready for April 2020. By and large, what you're looking at in respect to the changes for your everyday contractor is that instead of the contractor being responsible for making their own determination, the liability and responsibility, if your end client is a medium or large company, is shifting to that end client. They make the determination on your behalf. They then pass that decision down the contractual chain to agencies. If there are multiple agencies, then they're responsible for passing it to the first agency, and then the first agency is responsible for passing it to the second, third, fourth, etc. At the same time, the end client is responsible for giving that previously mentioned status determination statement straight to you, the worker. So they have to do both things to fulfill their obligations. In terms of how IR35 is managed, nothing's changing. It's still exactly the same rule set that was used prior to April 2020. It's just who's responsible for managing that is changing. Important to note that obviously, as I mentioned, prior to April, all of the liability still rests with you as a contractor if you're working in the public sector. So if you haven't considered IR35 to date and you have been working for 2-3 years, you probably ought to be looking at how you've been engaged to date, just so you've got a solid and fixed up to this point I was outside of IR35, or at the very least you know where you sat. Okay. So as I mentioned, the rule set in respect to how IR35 is assessed is not changing. It's just who's responsible for making that assessment that is changing. So there are a whole load of major and minor status tests that are essentially established in case law. The major status tests actually go all the way back to a piece of case law called ready mixed concrete that was in 1968, established in 1968, which is quite a bit before IR35 was even a thing. That established that there needs to be, for a, and to use an archaic bit of phrasing here, a master-servant relationship, i.e. one of employment, there needs to be the requirement for an individual to provide their personal service. They need to work under the control of the employer, and the exact phrasing is there also needs to be any other matters that are consistent with employment to establish an employer-employee relationship. From that, also, if you look into the actual case law itself, it does establish the third test that HMRC always forgets, mutuality of obligations. So I'll go into a bit more detail onto what each of these aspects are in a few minutes. And likewise, I'll cover off the minor status tests as well. So when we're dealing with, I suppose, weighting of IR35, you want to be predominantly looking at the major status tests or the main status tests, lack of personal service requirement, whether or not you're controlled by the client, and whether or not there's any mutuality of obligations between the parties. But you absolutely cannot ignore the minor status tests, such as, well, as mentioned on there, financial risk, provision of equipment, do you look like a contractor, does the client treat you as one, is there any intention to integrate you, things like that. All very important factors when dealing with IR35. So, moving on, lack of personal service requirement. Many consider this to be the most important point when it comes to IR35. I, at the moment, would probably agree with that, although there can be an argument that control is slowly but steadily creeping up and trying to take over on substitution as to what the, lack of personal service requirement as to what's the most important aspect. When dealing with the lack of personal service requirement, it is most often substitution that is spoke about here. So to be clear, substitution is the act of replacing yourself as the worker actually providing the services with another individual. From the client's perspective, nothing changes except for the individual providing the work. So they still continue to pay the agency still continues to pay your limited company, you just then pay the replacement worker, the substitute. It's fine for the client to have the right to veto that substitute, but it has to be on reasonable grounds. So the client can say, we're not accepting Joe Bloggs because Joe Bloggs obviously doesn't have the skill to do the work. That's acceptable. If, however, the worker that's being provided would provide the service just as well as you would originally, then there isn't really any reason why the client should reject that individual. I always liken it back to a plumber. You know, when you engage a plumber to come and fix your toilet at home, you're not bothered whether it's Tom the plumber or Joanne the plumber that turns up to do the work. You just want a plumber to fix the toilet. Same thing really applies to pretty much every contractor out there. Another consideration when dealing with lack of personal service or substitution, it's not necessarily the act of substituting that's important, although that is a really good indicator to prove you're outside of IR35. It's the hypothetical right of substitution that HMRC put a lot of stock in. So not can you provide somebody right now, but if you did have somebody, could you send them? That leads nicely on to a very common thing that comes up when I'm dealing with substitution, and that's around, oh, I'm the only person in my limited company, surely that means I can't provide a substitute. The reality of the situation is most contractors I deal with are the only person in the limited company, and they're not going to be able to, at the drop of a hat, find a substitute. But that doesn't stop them doing so. They could, you guys could engage an agency to source somebody for you. You could speak to your friend who's a limited company contractor. Perhaps you got some colleagues who have recently left the client site who could step in for you for a bit. There are a whole range of opportunities there really for finding a substitute, and just being the only person in your company is not the end of the world. If the client has the ability to reject the substitute because of any reason, like they don't like the hair color or something silly like that, then HMRC will consider that to be a fettered right of substitution, which effectively nullifies it and makes it largely irrelevant, I guess. Whilst we say that substitution is probably the most important test, it's not the only way of dealing with a lack of personal service requirement. There is also subcontracting to consider, or engaging helpers. Both of them will help prove that you have a lack of personal service, but they're not as strong as providing a substitute would be. So moving on to the next part, control. This one is very, very murky. Tends to be the one that a lot of contractors end up having a bit of difficulty understanding. You know, once substitution's explained, it's usually fairly, I wouldn't say black and white, but it's pretty obvious as to what the answer will be. With control, there's a whole load of shades of grey between what's fine and what's not. Generally speaking, when dealing with control, you split it into 4 separate aspects. So you've got what control the contractor is subject to, and you've got where the contractor is working, you have the hours the contractor is working, and how the contractor is doing the work. So to be clear, when it comes to control, it's reasonable for the end client to have overarching control, like they define what the project is. Yeah, at the end of the day, they're the ones with the money. It's perfectly reasonable for them to say, this is what you're here to do, this is when we want it by. Yeah. What isn't reasonable is when they're hovering over your shoulder and telling you how to do the work. You know, oh no, don't do this, do that, don't use that tool, use this one. At the end of the day, you've been engaged as the independent expert. If they're telling you how to do the work, how can you argue that you're an independent expert separate from the client? And ultimately, if they know how to do the work, why have they engaged you? Yeah. So when it comes to what, again, it's about that level of instruction that we're looking at there. They can define what the overarching project is, but the ultimate how to get from A to B should be your responsibility. Yeah. Covered in that is moving the contractor from task to task on a whim. It's fine for the client to come up to you and say, I'd like you to move over to this task, is that okay? And then you to have a discussion with them and say, that doesn't really fit in with the project scale at the moment, can't do that, this takes priority. Then there's a bit of a discussion there. But if they come up to you and say, you're now moving on to this new project, and you don't really have a choice in the matter, the client has control over you, okay? Where? Now, with where, this one is not carrying a great deal of weight with IR35, simply because there's generally a very good reason as to why the client is telling you to work from a specific location. Say, for example, you're a server architect or something similar to that, and the server you need to work on is located at a secure site. It's perfectly reasonable then for the client to say, you need to work at this location because we can't take that server out and move it to you. Yeah. So in that situation, there is a valid reason why you have to work at a certain location. However, if you have the ability to work from home or work from a separate office or work from a location of your choice, I'd always encourage you to do so, just because it proves that the client doesn't have the ability to tell you where to work, which can be a positive indicator for IR35. So just to recap on that, If there's a good reason why you can't work from a location of your choice, it's likely to be defendable. Okay. Similarly, when the hours are worked will often have a lesser impact as long as there is a good reason why you have to work at certain hours. One that came up very recently is that a contractor had to work with colleagues who were in America. So what were the time differences? The contractor had to be available within core hours. That is generally going to be acceptable from an IR35 perspective because that's unavoidable. Part of your work is liaising with those individuals. But on a general contractor, for a general contractor who doesn't have to work with colleagues in America and the such, or there isn't a good reason why you need to work set hours, you should have flexibility to determine when you do the work. You might have, say, a 40-hour contract in 40 hours per week, but it should be up to you to determine exactly how you spend that time. You could do 12 hours on the first day, 5 the next, 3 the next. You know, as long as it ultimately ends up with 40 at the end of the week, it shouldn't really bother the client too much. If you have a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday style of operation, then that can cause problems from an IR35 perspective, especially if they include a lunch break in that, because it should be up to you entirely when you have those lunch breaks. How the work is done. This is probably the biggest pointer, in my opinion, but as it says in the second bullet point at the bottom there, HMRC is unwilling to attribute great significance to this if the contractor is highly skilled. I don't believe that should be the case. Ultimately, how the work is done is very, very important when it comes to IR35. Again, using that earlier example of a plumber, you engage a plumber, tell them to fix the toilet, and then you trust in their experience to get the job done. You don't hover over the shoulder and tell them to use this pipe or that tool. They're the experts. Leave them to get on with the work. Same way, client defines the scope, the what of the work, but the how should be entirely up to you. Falling into that category would be things like, are you managed, or do you have management responsibilities over the client staff? Contractors should be entirely independent. If you have a manager, it can suggest that you are controlled in some way, yeah. Or if you are a manager, you've got integration issues, which can cause other problems for IR35. So, mutuality obligation, the test that HMRC forgot. Yeah, HMRC really don't like this test and try to pretend it doesn't exist at any given opportunity. Their argument goes, and I'll explain what mutuality obligations is in just a moment. Their argument goes that the simple act of signing a contract and accepting work with the client is sufficient to prove there's mutuality obligations in the engagement. That's not the case. That's what's referred to as the irreducible minimum. So mutuality obligation, to be a little bit clearer as to what it is, it's effectively there should be no expectation of work to be offered or accepted by either party. You're there for a fixed contract. That's the end of it. As I say, HMRC seem to believe that simply signing on the contract implies mutuality obligation. In reality, mutuality obligation is more having a rolling ongoing contract, or no ability to terminate the contract, or things like that, aspects that keep you committed to a single client for a long period of time with no option of renewal or anything like that. You're just locked into the contract for a long period of time. That will imply mutuality obligation. What the ideal is that you go in, do the work, that's it, leave. Yeah, the client might offer you an extension to your contract, but it should always be that, an offer for you to then consider and accept if you wish. There shouldn't be any expectation that that work will just continue to roll on and on and on and on until the end of time. Okay. There are multiple bits of case law out there that has established that HMRC really can't ignore mutuality obligation. And what you'll actually see in HMRC's CEST tool, or rather what you won't see in HMRC's CEST tool, is questions on mutuality obligations. They more or less blanket when they really should not. So, minor tests. As I say, these aren't as important as the major tests when it comes to IR35. Major tests being the three we just covered off. So lack of personal service requirement, levels of control you're subject to, and mutuality of obligations. But the minor tests can add up to being quite a fearsome sight when you consider them in mass. So it's very important you look at both sides of the fence, the minor and the majors. So I'm going to very quickly cover off some of the minor status tests. first and foremost, probably the most important of the minor status test is financial risk. The way I normally categorize this when I'm talking to contractors is whatever's bad for you personally is usually good from a financial risk perspective. So, you know, I'm sure any contractor out there would rather not have to buy in business insurances, but doing so will help show that you are a genuine contractor and you're taking financial risk. So it's a positive for IR35 purposes. Similarly, having to correct defective work at your own time and your own expense is a very good indicator for it. But it's not something that an employee would be expected to do. So, you know, all good financial risk indicators are generally bad for the contractor personally, but always very good to get a few in there. Another big one with that one as well is if you're invoicing for your services, there's a very, very good chance that at some point you will not get paid for that invoice for whatever reason. That's a good indicator for financial risk, and is always why we kind of encourage contractors to invoice their services rather than using a timesheet or self-billing system. Provision of equipment. So with this one, it is a minor status test. A lot of contractors and agencies out there think that it's quite an important one. The reality is it's not really. A contractor should really provide their own equipment wherever possible, because it will show that they are operating a genuine business. Once again, they take a financial risk because they're having to buy the equipment, all that sort of thing. But HMRC put a very low stock in it if it's just sundry stuff that you're purchasing. And unfortunately, they would consider purchasing a laptop as being quite low value. Yeah, when they're considering provision of equipment, and the only time it really considered to be a major test, or not a major test, but a more important test, is when there is a large financial value attached to it. An example that's given is if you're a bricklayer, for example, and you bring a load of bricks with you to do the work, and they're used up in the provision of the services. You then don't take that equipment away with you to work on the next job; they're gone. Yeah, so that's an investment that's been made into the work that's being done. That will have a lot more bearing than an IT contractor using the same laptop they've used in the last 6 or 7 contractors. So really, when you're considering that test, it really is only the bigger ticket items that are going to be important from an IR35 perspective. So basis of payment. This falls a little bit into what I mentioned previously in relation to invoicing versus self-billing or timesheeting systems. Reality is, if you use a timesheeting system, it's not the end of the world. It'll largely be considered neutral, because a lot of the times the client's simply using that system as a means of budgetary control rather than a means of controlling you and how you do the work. Yeah, so it's not going to be a huge factor if you have to use a timesheet or a self-billing system, but if you can invoice, you probably should do. Yeah. In relation to how you're paid, the absolute best circumstance for a contractor is that they are paid a single fixed rate for the work they do. So they've been engaged for a 6-month contract. At the end of that 6 months, they get £25,000. Or I should say, once the project's completed, they get £25,000. It's an estimated 6-month contract. Contractor finishes that work in 3 months, they still get the full £25,000. Contractor finishes that work in a year and a half, they still only get £25,000. You know, one side you've got financial risk in that it might take longer than you expect. On the other side, you've got sound management of your business in that you have profited from early completion of that work, and then you can move on to another project. Sat in between those, you've got your daily or hourly rates. Those are perfectly fine from an IR35 perspective as well, because ultimately it helps reflect that factor that you don't get paid for the time you don't work if you're on an hourly or daily rate. Right at the bottom of the scale and bad side of things is effectively a fixed monthly payment that you receive, irrespective of how many days you work in that month. That, to HMRC, will look very similar to a salary and should be avoided. Bundled into that as well would be things like receiving bonus payments and the like, which should be avoided from an IR35 perspective. Doubly so if they are very similar to a scheme that an employee receives at the client site. Integration. So simply put, with this one, it's whether or not the contractor looks like an employee or whether or not they look like a contractor. This one isn't as important as it used to be, because pretty much every contractor out there at some point will need to work as part of a team, which can suggest integration and can have a few issues attached to it, but by and large, being part of a team will not be a problem from an IR35 perspective. What you're looking at for this really is whether or not the contractor is invited to training events or social events like the Christmas party, that sort of thing. Do the client staff know that that individual is a contractor, or do they just simply see them as being another employee? Always keep that firm and fixed barrier between yourselves and the client's employees. For example, the Christmas party, it's fine for you to attend said Christmas party, but you need to make sure that you are paying your way for it. So you don't get a free ticket to it and you don't get paid for the time spent attending that. Same with training, okay? So a couple of other pretty rapid fire minor status tests. Length of engagement. Very common misconception is that the length of engagement, once you hit a 2-year time period, you have to leave because you'll be caught by IR35. That's not the case at all. Length of engagement has pretty much no bearing on IR35. It's fair to say that short-term contracts, like a day, a week long contracts, are unlikely to attract HMRC's attention, but HMRC can quite easily go after any length of engagement, whether or not it's simply a 1-day one or a 5-year one, just to prove a point. So don't rely on any form of length of engagement to be a indicator for IR35 purposes. It's not, simply put. Right to termination. Contractors should always have the right to terminate, the ideal being that they have a 0-day notice period, but generally speaking, anything up to a month will be considered acceptable, but there should always be a right to terminate. Non-exclusivity of services. As a contractor, you should be free to work for whoever you want. Yeah, there might be no compete clauses in the contract. That's fine, because that's just there to protect the client's business. As long as they aren't overbearing, then it's going to be fine, defendable from an IR35 perspective. Employee type benefits. This would be things like overtime pay, holiday pay, sick pay, all of that sort of stuff a contractor should not receive. For overtime specifically, if you do need to perform extra hours and you are on an hourly rate, you should only ever receive your basic hourly rate. You should not receive an inflated rate. That's an employee benefit. Intention of the parties, generally considered to be quite rock bottom when it comes to IR35, but sometimes the deciding factor can be whether or not the contract is intended to be one of employment or one of contracted to contracted to client style of arrangements. Can't hurt to have a clause like that in the contract and to make it clear that that is the intention, but ultimately if the rest of the engagement points to one way or the other, that clause is not really going to have much bearing. Employment terminology. Always try to avoid using employment terminology. So don't say you're employed by the client, say you're engaged by them. You don't have a line manager or just a manager, you have a hiring manager or you have a client contact. Yeah, that sort of terminology, if you can get it into the mindset of actually using it, will help from an IR35 perspective, because it will sort of catch out any leading questions that HMRC might want to ask. Office holders. This one can be quite a significant problem, simply because an office holder will generally be integrated quite heavily or will be subject to control of the client. So what we mean by an office holder, and it's a difficult thing to define precisely, but essentially it's a post that existed prior to a contractor occupying it and will continue to exist after, irrespective of who holds that position. So you're looking at your directors, your financial officers, your chief technical officers, that sort of position, all those high level positions that in an organizational structure will have a position there, irrespective of whether or not it's an employee or a contractor that's filling that role. If you are an office holder, it's not impossible for you to be outside of IR35, but I'd be willing to bet that you would struggle saying that you can sort of legitimately supply a substitute and that you're not under the control of the client in some way or have control over the client in some way. So a lot to consider there if you're an office holder.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matt. Hopefully that gave everyone a very good, clear understanding of what it looks like to be working inside and outside. We've had a number of questions come through whilst the webinar has been going on, and there's always questions around a specific point. Does this one factor make me inside? Does it make me outside? And unfortunately, it is looking at the bigger picture. So it's looking at everything that Matt has just gone through, which is why, you know, there are organisations out there that can offer reviews and offer assistance around this if you need it. But we completely appreciate that it is quite a big task to get your head around, am I inside or am I outside? So taking the time now to educate yourselves and then educating your clients is probably the best step forward. So just a very quick introduction. I am the legal manager here at the Kingsbridge Group. My experience is previously all recruitment related. So obviously these changes significantly affect the recruitment sector as well as contractors out there. Again, it was something that recruiters and end engagers never really had to worry about, and now they're having to get their heads around where this liability sits and who has to make the decision. So Andy already touched on it, the fact that as soon as the client has kind of overcome those obligations of issuing an SDS with reasons, taking reasonable care, they're actually off the hook. And a lot of clients still don't understand this, because if there is a fee payer in the chain, they are the one taking on the liability. So that's why the recruiters out there are also very concerned around, the recruiters and the agencies are also very concerned and are hopefully doing a lot of work with their contractor workforce and with their clients to try and educate on this. So what on this slide, I don't mean to paint too much of a rosy picture, but really what we're trying to do is explain the fact that although this change is happening and we don't want to underplay it, is significant. Actually, the law has been the same, you know, since it came in 2000. So what we need to do to make the impact as minimal as possible is educate as much as we can. So like Matt's already said, and I'm sure you all have quite a good understanding of what it looks like to be in and what it looks like to be out, and I'm sure the majority of you have been working outside for a number of years. So really what it's for you to do is go out and get evidence and talk to your clients and talk to your recruiters around why this is the case. And I don't mean to kind of underplay the fact that clients are taking very rash decisions at the moment, and we're seeing it all over the press, you know, the big banks making policies where it's PAYE, umbrella only. And we've all seen it in the public sector. There was mass walkouts, there was changing of decisions, and we're going to see a lot of ups and downs as it comes to April and it fades. So, you know, just bear with them, educate as much as you possibly can, because like I said, the law is exactly the same. They just need to understand that they now have a responsibility to kind of assist with this, making this status determination. That the review that we've had and we're waiting for the conclusion on really is trying to push the fact that this should not be affecting the genuinely self-employed. Now, it is affecting the genuinely self-employed, and we all appreciate that, but it shouldn't, and that's not the intention behind the legislation. So if we keep trying to push that message, I think HMRC's actual statistic is around, they believe, a third of contractors are genuinely self-employed. So if we look at that against the whole UK PSC economy, you know, it shouldn't be affecting us as much as it is, but unfortunately it is the case. Is it, just to clarify, is it a third they're saying should be operating inside IR35, I think, isn't it? So 2/3. Yeah, so 2/3. Two-thirds are genuine, self-employed. But the problem, of course, is that the clients are all shoving everyone inside. We've had lots of questions on that, you know, and that's the difficulty, isn't it? Definitely. I think, and that's what, you know, we're not here today to try and, you know, go into too much detail around the factors and not appreciate what's going on out there, because we know that it is. But hopefully we can give you a few things to take away that might kind of minimise this impact, because there are a lot of, and I see them coming up more and more, there are a lot of end engagers and especially recruiters. I mean, we work with over 500 of them, along with the top 50 recruiters, all the big MSPs out there, and they really are trying to engage with their end engagers, their end clients, to help educate on this, to kind of minimise the impact. So there is stuff going on. There are some clients out there that are taking a very pragmatic approach. Larsen, Howie, who Matt works for, they're doing a lot of work with end engagers and recruiters to help determine status on an individual basis instead of making any sort of blanket or PAYE only policies. So some next steps, what can you do? So we're seeing a lot around statement of work out there, statement of work, outsourced services, consultancy. The reason being is that if you are genuinely providing an outsourced service, then the rules, you should be outside of IR35. It's a very outside of IR35 way of working. If you have an end engager, an end client that then engages with a consultancy that's providing an outsourced service, they are then not responsible for making that status determination or holding their liability. So it's very attractive to end clients if they think they can engage with a consultancy that's providing a project as opposed to kind of labour bums on seats, because they then don't have to worry about this. So that's why you're hearing a lot around statement of work and this way of working. Now, all I would say is be very careful, because there's no doubt going to be a lot of companies that are setting up as a consultancy, and everyone's got a consultancy arm now because they're looking at doing this. It just needs to make sure it's a genuinely outsourced project, and it's not exactly the same way that you were working, but now suddenly you've got a statement of work contract in place instead of a recruitment contract. So they are genuine, and they obviously do help with this, and I'm sure we're going to see a big increase over the next few years of statement of work, but just be aware of any non-compliant models. Moving organisations, like I said, there are a lot of organisations that are being pragmatic. Have a look online, have a look at the forums and see what's going on, because I know contractors are talking to each other, and there are some clients out there that are doing things properly. And I think the press over the last week has really changed that. It's all really now talking about the fact that, mass contractors walk out, businesses suffering. We weren't seeing this at all. It was all the headlines were around, blanket policies, PAYE only, tax dodgers, all of this. I've really noticed a change in the last week. So I think we need to keep going with that. Look at the clients out there. If you do have transferable skills, look at the clients out there that are doing things properly. Flee the country, and this isn't a joke. I think there are a lot of contractors that are looking at leaving the UK, and I don't blame them really. It will calm down. It has calmed down with the public sector. I mean, we work with a few recruiters out there that are kind of back to where they were, and they do have a lot of contractors engaged via limited companies in the public sector. It will calm down, but it is obviously going to be an issue. It's going to be a big bump in the road. Other engagement models, there's been a lot of questions around PAYE, umbrella, and obviously that's being led by clients. So just be very careful. If you are using an umbrella model, they're absolutely fine as long as they're compliant. You are an employee if you work through an umbrella company. So you have exactly the same tax deductions, exactly the same rights as any other employee. So you need to make sure that's the case. There's obviously trade bodies and organisations out there that can help you make sure that you're looking at the right companies, but just be careful. I mean, we saw all the stuff that happened with the loan schemes before. That's what you don't want to end up with. If it looks too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. So just be very careful with any engagement model that sounds very, very favourable. PAYE workers, I mean, I don't know what your opinion is, Matt and Andy, but my opinion is very highly skilled, highly paid contractors that have got used to running their own limited company, being a director of such, do not suddenly want to change to being an agency worker.
No, that absolutely they don't. I mean, a lot we get. Our members are basically aghast at all these rules, and this is what they'd be. The whole purpose, of course, is that the government wants to get more people onto the payroll. Ironically, they call it the off-payroll rules. It should be the on-payroll rules, and people do not want to do that. They see themselves as independent businesses. The autonomy that lends them is extremely important to them. And these rules are forcing people, whether IR35 should truly apply or not, bearing in mind what we've just heard from Matt over how we determine status. That's sort of being thrown out the window. Basically, the clients are terrified of IR35 because everyone always has been. It's so difficult. No one understands it. So they're just saying, oh, just put them on the payroll. And of course, people don't want to. So it's causing big disruption. Yeah, definitely. Education, I mean, it's obviously key, and there hasn't been enough of it, especially from the government. And I think that's the biggest issue here is clients are petrified.
they don't know how to do this, so they don't want to consider it. The ones that are actually doing it properly have gone, actually, this isn't that bad. You know, it's not too difficult to make a status determination, but it's just the panic of doing it. So keep educating. We're going to carry on doing it. Obviously, IPSE are going to carry on doing it, but we completely appreciate the frustration that it's not always that easy. Insurance. So I'm just going to very, very quickly touch on IR35 insurance. So Kingsbridge kind of officially launched their brand new IR35 insurance in November. So we've always done this, but what we've done is we've updated it that it will now cover the end client and the fee payer, whoever's left liable under the legislation. So obviously, most of the time, it's not going to be the contractor anymore, apart from unless you're working for a small company. However, a lot of contractors are wanting to go and get reviews done, get IR35 insurance, and go to their clients, go to their recruiters and say, look, you know, I've got this covered. We're also working with clients and recruiters that are also looking at enforcing it, purchasing it, and all those kind of things. So it's definitely out there, it's in the market. There's a couple of points on this slide of what it covers. Obviously, it's not just the investigations, it is covering the tax loss as well, which seems to be the biggest worry of those end clients and those recruiters out there. And we're doing a lot of work with Larsen and Howie, who's a part of the Kingsbridge Group, offering the reviews along with the insurance. So you can see that there's an offer on that page as well. So if you do want any more information on that, just get in touch with us after the webinar. The best email to contact us with any questions is ir35@kingsbridge.co.uk. I think we're going to try and whiz through a few questions. So just a few next steps from this: review and evidence gathering, building your case. So a lot of questions are around, what do I do? My client's saying, you know, I'm going to be determined inside. I've found out that I'm outside, but my client said I'm inside. All we can really say with this is push as much as possible. Go and have a review done, get your evidence together, explain. There were a lot of questions around substitution, that you've got it in your contract, but your client's saying that you've never done it. You don't, I think Matt explained that very well. You don't have to have ever substituted yourself, as long as you have a genuine right that you could substitute yourself and they would accept it. Along with all the criteria that we went through, then that's fine. So it really is just kind of educating them on what substitution actually looks like. So go out, build your case as much as possible if you do want to continue working outside, or alternatively, like I say, you might look at organisations that are doing things properly. Getting IR35 insurance in place, educating everyone that you can, talking to your clients and recruiters, and obviously continuing lobbying. So I know all the trade bodies, I know IPSE are going to continue really hard right until up when it comes in and past that.
And beyond.
Yeah. So a few Q&As. I think we've got over 100, so we've got 5 minutes left. So we'll try and touch on a few, and then, like I said, if anyone has any questions left, if you email ir35@kingsbridge.co.uk, we can make sure they're filtered up to Andy and Matt. And we'll also make sure that we answer all the questions that have come in a follow-up document along with the recording after the webinar. So Andy, do you want me to kick off with any questions that you...
Yes, so we've had a bunch of questions. You've already mentioned this. A lot of people saying, but you know, I've had my contract reviewed. I'm satisfied that IR35 does not apply to my current engagement, but the client has either already told me that they're going to say IR35 applies, or I'm getting a strong feeling that they're going to go that way. What can they do about it? Well, one thing is to say is that there's a new thing in this legislation, which is called a client-led dispute resolution service. It's actually in the legislation itself. It gives you a right to challenge your client. This wasn't in the public sector rules in 2017. So you can go to your client and you can say, I'm challenging that. You can present them evidence. And this is what Nicola was talking about of, you know, go and get your contract reviewed. Perhaps do your own CESTL version, you know, get any evidence you can together for why it is that you are not an employee, you are a contractor. The problem is, though, and I have to say, IPSE is not confident about this client-led status review thing, because clients don't have to change their minds. All they've got to do, they've got 45 days in which to come back to you and say, oh, we're either sticking to our decision or we're changing it. They have to give you some reasons for that, but I think most of the time clients are just going to stick to their decision, I'm afraid to say. So we're saying to the government, people need access to some kind of independent arbitration service, be that the courts or whatever. Of course, that would be so resource heavy that they're not prepared to do it. So there is that there, but I'm afraid that if your client insists that IR35 applies, there is actually nothing that you can do about it except end the engagement, which is the sort of nuclear option. That I'm afraid is the brutal truth. There's been some other questions around travel expenses and tax relief on equipment and things like this. So travel expenses, first of all, the government changed the rules on travel and subsistence expenses a few years ago. When IR35 applies, you are not entitled to travel and subsistence expenses. This is huge. So if you travel a long way to your client to do the contract, you're obviously, that costs a lot of money and you're claiming that back against the tax. You can't do that if they decide IR35 applies, which will basically mean some of those engagements are just not viable for contractors. So what does this mean? Again, it means the government's introducing something which is going to kill work opportunities for people, which I'm sure they don't intend to do, but that is what's going to happen. So this is another big problem with the legislation. Tax relief on equipment, of course, because you're now going to be taxed at source, right? If your client's decided that IR35 applies, which means you can no longer do what you used to do, which is just work out what are my expenses and pay tax based on the profits. But you can claim back tax relief on things like equipment and genuine business expenses via the self-assessment return at year end. So there will be provision for you to do that, but not on travel and subsistence. This is another big one that a lot of people have asked, is about retrospective investigations. So the question is, well, I'm currently in an engagement. I'm satisfied that IR35 does not apply, and I have not been voluntarily operating IR35. But come April, my client's going to flip the switch and say IR35 applies now. Are HMRC going to come after me for the period of time before April and launch a retrospective investigation? Well, they have actually been somewhat helpful here and given a sort of assurance that they won't do that. They said they won't use information gathered from the client's SDS to launch an investigation. However, they haven't totally ruled it out. There's a couple of caveats in there about, well, if people have criminal behaviour and fraud, which IR35 isn't. So, you know, I would say to you, you do need to be wary of it. And even if they don't use the SDS, you remain liable for that period of time before April, up until April, for the last 6 years. So if you've got tax investigation insurance in place, you don't just want to end it because we're now going into this new era. You're still liable for that previous 6 years. And you know, if you have insurance via lots of providers, including IPSE membership, keep it going because you could be liable.
It's also very important to note with that is, yes, HMRC have said that they won't look back, but that doesn't stop them. They've got a genuine reason as to why they want to go back and look at, say, last year's tax return, well, last year's contract. They can do that. There's nothing stopping them doing that. They just won't specifically use the change in status as a reason for it, or so they say.
Absolutely right. Couldn't agree more, Matt. How much time have we got? I mean, I can keep answering questions, but I don't know if we want it, because it's 1:30 now. Do we want to keep going for another 5 minutes or not? What do you want to do?
We'll carry on and do a few more. I think that just a couple of quick fire answers I can give you. Definition of an SME, so the exemption. So obviously this is the end client, so the end client has to be the SME. That they have to satisfy 2 of 3 criteria, which is either less than 50 employees, less than a £10.2 million turnover, and a 5.1 million
on the balance sheet.
Yeah, so if you satisfy 2 of those 3, then you are a small company. Obviously this is for the client to determine if they are a small company, but it's definitely something contractors are looking towards. You know, but how much opportunity out there is there for small companies hiring thousands of contractors? Well, there's not, because you know that otherwise there'd probably be a large company. There was also a question around if this applies to sole traders. So no, it doesn't. There is a different piece of legislation that applies to sole traders that came in quite a while ago actually, and essentially it's very similar to IR35. It's all around supervision, direction and control. So acting as a sole trader does no means suddenly mean that you don't have to worry about this. In fact, you know, recruiters and agencies have been worried about that for years, and rarely do they engage with sole traders. So So no, it's not kind of another get around, but no, the rules do not apply to it.
There's been a few questions on the CESS tool. That's the check employment status for tax tool, which the government brought out initially in 2017 when the public sector rules came in. This is being used particularly by hiring organisations to make these status determinations. Lots of people are very sceptical about its accuracy. IPSE is one of those groups. We have been quite vocal in our criticisms of CESS. They've done a new version of it, and in the new version, we're still very critical of it. It seems to us that there is an extraordinary amount of weight on the substitution question. There's one question that asks about substitution somewhere near the beginning, and it goes on to ask you about 25 more questions. But if the client says, oh yeah, I'll accept a substitute, you're quite likely to end up with an outside of IR35. In fact, you have to work quite hard to not get that. If the client says, I will not accept a substitute, then it's very, very difficult to get it. In fact, I haven't managed to do it. I have managed to get it so that it says that it can't tell, but I've never been through the tool myself. I've tried different permutations and said no substitution and managed to then get IR35 does not apply at the end of it. And on substitution, lots of people have asked questions on this, and someone asked if the individual person is named in the contract, is that a bit of a problem? I don't know what you think, Matt. I think that is a problem. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, the individual shouldn't be named in the contractual terms. It should literally just be between your company and the client or your agency. If, however, they want to name an individual in the contract, it needs to be very clear that it's not specifically that individual that needs to do all of the work and that a substitute can be provided. So say initial consultant being the defining term, or having the written in the contract or agreed substitute as per whatever the substitution clause is, something like that. Make it very clear that yes, they're naming an individual to start off with, but by no means are they saying that they are the only ones who have to do the work.
Yeah, I would agree. Someone was also asking about if there's case law around substitution. Well, yeah, all the stuff that Matt discussed, it's all based on case law, all these determining factors. This is one of the problems with the IR35 rules, because case law is very difficult to work out. There's no statutory test. It's not simple. It's why people don't like the CESS tool, because you can't really apply a tool like that to something as nuanced as case law. But interestingly, on substitution, it's actually in the legislation itself. So right at the one of the very first clauses, it says personal service is required. So that's a sort of interesting one, that's right in there. The government have tried to diminish the substitution test over the years because they were worried that people just bung a clause in the contract and it's a bit false. But it's right there in the legislation, so they can't really get rid of it too much. I think that it remains a really important part of the test for IR35.
Definitely. Right, so we've got to 1:35, so I think we should probably wrap up now. Like I said, we will go through all the questions that we've received. If you have any further questions, then please contact Kingsbridge, and like I said, we'll dish them out accordingly. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. We hope you found it useful, and I'm sure we'll be doing another one as it gets closer to April and post-April to keep everyone informed. And thanks very much to our guest speakers, Matt Tyler from Larsen, Howie, and Andy Chamberlain from IPSE.
Thank you.
Thank you.